The USS Missouri and the Siege of Camp Pendleton. A short story by Doug Furr, July 5, 1986. The newly formed Republic of California had a problem. The United States Marine Corps garrison at Camp Pendleton. The Marines had stubbornly refused to join the San Diego Naval Mutiny. Then they had refused to join the following general uprising of military installations on the West Coast and the subsequent Californian Revolution. Now they were refusing to either lay down their arms or swear loyalty to the new nation. The interim president of California, the former governor, wanted to send a message that further loyalty to the United States would no longer be tolerated. They were the Republic of California now. One of the admirals of the new Californian Navy presented an interesting idea. The USS Missouri had been undergoing a refit at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard to bring her back in service when the Yellowstone eruption occurred in 1985. Since then, work had paused, but she was still in good overall condition. Her propulsion and many of her auxiliary systems were offline, but she was still seaworthy, and, most importantly, both her main and secondary batteries were in service. Furthermore, a stash of 16-inch high-explosive shells was also seized in San Diego during the mutiny. The president ordered the ship refloated, and on the evening of July 8th, a fleet of tugboats began towing her down the coast towards Oceanside. The Marines were given a final ultimatum and a chance to surrender by midnight that night. No response was received. The skeleton crew on the Missouri then proceeded to fire her entire stores of high-explosive rounds into the base, flattening everything except the family housing complexes. At the end of the siege, a parade of the surviving, starving Marines and their families marched out of the front gate, carrying improvised white flags. The Missouri was then towed out to San Clemente Island, where she was again anchored and served as a radar picket during the so-called Battle of the Channel Islands. Interestingly, the U.S. Navy had sent the USS Iowa from Pearl Harbor in an attempt to subdue the rebellion. She joined the rest of the U.S. flotilla in sort of floating around, waiting for definitive orders to open fire, which they were honestly hoping never came. The U.S. Navy had not received word of the siege of Camp Pendleton and were not aware of the Missouri's status when they spotted her at anchor. The Iowa's captain ordered her to fire a warning salvo across the bow of the Missouri to see how she would respond. The MO returned in kind with a salvo across her bow. While they did not directly shoot at each other, it can be argued that this was the last time in history that two battleships fought each other. Despite her incomplete refit, she served with distinction and survived the battle unscathed. Coterminous to the story of the Missouri is the story of Lance Corporal Michael F. Adamson. Lance Corporal Adamson was an intelligence specialist in the United States Marine Corps, stationed at Camp Pendleton during the eruption. Born and raised in Redding, California, he was inspired to join the Marines by his grandfather, who was a Marine Corsair pilot in World War II. He, wisely, didn't keep a journal or discuss his political beliefs much with his fellow Marines. But some of his friends and family back in Redding remarked he held fairly libertarian views, and in particular after the eruption, he started to become disillusioned with the United States. Regardless, he stood by his fellow Marines and did not join the mutiny on the West Coast. There were only a handful of survivors of the following siege. The following series of events was pieced together from these few survivor accounts. He was one of the first Marines to intercept radio messages coming from the Missouri as she was towed out to sea, and he was one of the first Marines to receive the ultimatum to the garrison to surrender. Along with his fellow intel specialists, he was directly ordered not to respond by the general in command of Pendleton himself. At some point, one of the intel specialists, possibly Lance Corporal Adamson himself, realized that the civilians had not been evacuated from the family housing facilities on the base. This information was passed up the chain of command, but the order remained not to respond, as again, command didn't believe they had ammunition for the Missouri's guns. Distraught, at the end of his shift, Lance Corporal Adamson sneaked off into one of the canyons on base, hoping to seek shelter in the pending bombardment. As he approached the perimeter fence, he spotted a patrol of California National Guardsmen. He called out to them. However, this also alerted some Marine sentries nearby, who shot him in the back. They were beaten back after a brief exchange of gunfire with the Californians, who now cautiously approached the fence where they had seen Lance Corporal Adamson. He laid slumped against the fence, slowly bleeding out. With his dying breaths, he begged the Californians to get word to the Missouri and the flotilla that there were still women and children on the base, and not to bombard the civilian housing complexes. The captain of the Missouri was probably already aware of this, but Lance Corporal Adamson's heroic sacrifice to protect the civilians at Camp Pendleton was widely reported, and he was regarded as one of the heroes of the secession. For his selflessness, courage, and valor, he became the first recipient of the Californian Medal of Honor and is the only non-Californian service person to have been awarded it to this day. He is also the only non-Californian service person to have a ship named after them, the Yosemite-class destroyer CNS Michael F. Adamson. After the battle, the Missouri was towed back to Long Beach, where she languished for several years as her fate was decided. Initially, the California Navy wished to continue modernizing her to use as their new flagship. However, priority was given to funding and modernizing the CNS Kitty Hawk. There wasn't enough room in the budget for two large capital ships, and as such, the Missouri was formally decommissioned in 1989. Of note, she was the only former USN ship in the California Navy to have never been renamed with the CNS prefix, and is the only ship of the fleet named after an eastern state. She was subsequently stricken from the register a year later and donated to the Pacific Battleship Foundation, later Pacific Battleship Center, and she now resides at the Port of Los Angeles, where USS Iowa is on display in the real world. She is maintained as a museum ship, while slowly being cosmetically restored to her 1945 appearance. The museum focuses on her service during the Second World War and her subsequent commandeering during the Revolution, while her post-war and Korean War service is mostly glossed over, as is the politics of her reactivation.